Hello, I'm Doris Diether, and I have something to say. My grandmother was from Finland, and she had a couple of kids, and apparently she didn't get along too well with her husband. And so she came over to the United States with the kids and changed her name so he couldn't find her. And then she went back to Finland just before the war started, and she got stuck over there. And she had to move with I had pictures of her with a white robe on. They covered themselves up with white robes, and when the planes would come over, they dropped down in the snow so they couldn't be seen.
Ooh.
And then she came back to the United States again, and my folks were both working. And so she took over taking care of me. And of course, I kind of inherited her wild spirit. So, and it showed up pretty quick.
Yeah?
Yeah. As I said, when I was interviewed the other day, the guy brought up about my high school. And he said, "Tell me about the high school." And I said, "Oh, all right." I was in a class that was what do you call it? The one that has the tests, the Regents class in the subject. And I reported to the class the first day, and the teacher called out 4 names, and mine was one of them. And he said, "I want you to get out of the class." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because you're not up to my standards." So I thought about that. So the next day I showed up in class again. And he said, "What are you doing here? I told you to get out of the class." And I said, "Well, I discovered you're the only Regents class in this subject, so I'm staying." So I did. And he picked on me the whole class, the whole session. He picked on me. And then we got to the end, and he figured that I would fail the test, and then he would get rid of me. And when they gave the test, I got 65 on the test, on the Regents test. So I passed. And so that was one of my early battles. I never went to college. It's interesting, though, I taught a college class. I was, when the zoning came out in 1960, I wanted to see what they were doing to our neighborhood. So I got the volumes from the City Planning Commission. I went through the volumes and checked to see what they were going to do in our area and how it was going to affect our area. And so I didn't take the class in that. I just studied it on my own. And then the community board wanted to have something on it. So I started teaching a little group at the community board about how the zoning worked and what they should be looking for and so forth. And CUNY found out about it. And CUNY hired me to come up and teach at CUNY. And I thought it was very funny that I'm teaching students at CUNY and I'm not even a graduate of the college.
That's wonderful. How did you first get interested in housing issues? Do you recall?
You know, they were started doing things like changing the zoning and putting up high-rise buildings and so forth and so on. And I found out that they were doing this from the zoning. So I decided to study the zoning to see how they were doing this and what we could do about it. And, you know, I found out that you can change the zoning and you can block certain things, high rises and so forth, by changing the zoning to something else. They had 8th Street zoned differently, and I changed the zoning on 8th Street. And I worked in a lot of the other areas in the area down here of, you know, keeping them from changing the zoning or blocking their proposals for high rises and so forth. You notice this area has very few high rise buildings. And so that was, you know, part of what I was working on was to keep the area the way it was. I also worked on the historic districts, getting the historic districts in the village and extending them. They put a little district like 6 blocks or something, and then I'd get them to extend it for 3 or 4 more blocks, and so that the buildings would be protected. And I met a lot of people that way. I think I was the first one to get into the South Village from uptown. The South Village was almost all Italian,
Mm-hmm.
and they kind of felt that they were separate from the rest of the village. And but when they started trying to rezone it down there, a couple of the people started talking to me.
So when would this have been?
That was in the 60s too, I think.
In the 60s too. And was that part of the Washington Square Robert Moses plan?
No, the Robert
That's
Moses
a
wasn't that interested in the South Village.
Okay.
He was interested in the area just south of Washington Square Park and the NYU territories and so forth.
Right.
And the first fight I had with him was about Shakespeare in the Park, which wasn't down here, it was uptown further. And that was the first fight I had with Robert Moses. He wanted to get rid of free Shakespeare in the Park. And my husband and I didn't have a lot of money, so we used to go to free Shakespeare in the Park quite often. And when I found that he was trying to get rid of free Shakespeare in the Park, I wrote a blasting letter to the newspapers, which I still have, and it's an open letter to the people of New York. And I blasted Robert Moses in the letter, and it got publicity, and it got around, and pretty soon they decided to forget about getting rid of free Shakespeare in the Park. They had a big article in the Daily News, and they printed my letter. And the letter, of course, got printed in the village newspapers, too. And so enough people suddenly discovered something was going on that they didn't know about. And I met Joe Papp, who was the head of Shakespeare in the Park. And he and I organized some things, too. And
You mean some protests?
So we kept the free Shakespeare in the Park.
So that was your first fight with Robert Moses. What came next?
Well, fighting about Washington Square Park. And the guy that he had put in charge of the park, he and I didn't get along either. George Vilonicus, do you know him?
I don't, didn't.
And he's the head of the park now. And he's with the Conservancy. And I felt that was kind of a conflict of interest. I mean, if you're the head of the park, you're supposed to be in charge of the park and not the head of another group that's working with their own plan. So he and I don't get along too well either. He sees me in the park, he says hello.
Good.
And he knows who I am.
So tell me more about the first debate about the Washington Square with Robert Moses.
Well, I found out, I found out that the proposal is to extend the bus route. There used to be buses through the park, but they used to just go around the fountain and go out again. And I found out that he wanted to extend it so that the buses would go straight through the park and down to the south part. And that meant that they were going to have to change, the sections of the park and so forth. And because they couldn't have playgrounds with the buses going through and so forth. And so I started fighting the buses in the park and publicizing that. And then, of course, they moved the fountain. It used to be exactly in the center of the park. And they moved it so that it's opposite the arch. And he and I had a fight about that, too. And he said, it's so nice because now you can look through the fountain, you can see the fountain coming down the thing. I said, yeah, and you look the other way, and you see all the traffic coming toward you. But I thought that was a waste of money because the park needed, so many other things. And to waste all that money moving the fountain 20 feet.
Right.
To me, it was ridiculous.
And then you were just telling me before, your most recent campaign about the park has to do with musicians?
Yeah, that was about 2 years ago, I guess it was.
Okay.
Yeah. And apparently some of the people in the fancy buildings on the south side, the north side of the park, the Fifth Avenue buildings on the just north of the park, didn't like to have the musicians because it bothered them. The music bothered them. And I thought that was pretty silly. And so Veronica's got this meeting together, and he was going to invite the Como, who's the head of the Parks Department, to come to the meeting. And I found out where the meeting was. And so I went around to all the musicians in the park and told them where the meeting was and what time and so forth. And we had a good crowd of musicians there at the meeting. I think more musicians than non-musicians showed up. And Como walked in and he took a look at the crowd and he saw me and he said, "Hello, Doris." And I was surrounded by the musicians with their instruments and so forth. He could tell what they were. And he said, "Hello, Doris, how are you today?" And I said, "I'm fine." And then he sat down and Veronica started the meeting. And I think it was only about a half an hour or so into the meeting that the Parks Commissioner said, "I don't think we have to go through this." So the musicians stayed in the park. So almost all the musicians in the park know me.
I can understand why. Absolutely. And were you a part of the time in the 60s when they tried to get the the folk musicians out of the park?
Yeah, I was involved.
Were you involved with them as well?
Yeah, but that had a big group involved with them at that time. So it was just part of the group.
Mm.
And
so I know we could ask you questions all day, but we don't have it. But I do want to ask you, do you have any advice for younger activists?
Listen to what's going on and then speak up about it. But most of the time they don't listen to what's going on. You know, they have the slightest idea what's going on. And I find this even at the community board, when they get new members on the community board and they sit there and they're kind of, what are they talking about, you know? They have the slightest idea what some of these issues are. And of course a few of them have now started following me. You know, they'll come up to me and say, "Why are you voting this way? Why are you voting this way?" You know, and I'll tell them why. "Oh, okay." So I get a few extra votes from some of the newer members who are, you know, kind of learning.
So you're kind of saying, do your homework.
Yeah.
Like find out the details.
Yeah.
Is that part of it?
Yeah. Listen to what's going on. I mean, don't live in your own little world.